Sure,
Feels
that's
good.
great. Yeah, and so I think that what we wanted to today was talk specifically about kind of, not just what is DevOps, although that's interesting, but you know, DevOps in Azure, right? So from the beginning kind of perspective, right? Um, this is a quote from Donovan Brown up at Microsoft. He's one of the great evangelists for DevOps, where he talks about the union of people, process, and products. Um, and more than anything, I think that the most interesting word for me is value, right? Where he says value there. I think that that's the most important piece, driving value to our users, right, is the thing that I really want to focus on, right, as a practitioner of DevOps. And in this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about the products, right? We're going to talk about Azure DevOps some. We're going to talk about Azure, just sort of the built-in pieces, and give you a sense of how you can deploy, how you can manage some things, just to help you and introduce some neat concepts, right? Now, one of the most important and confusing things is some of the terms that we have with DevOps, right? And I like to use this couple slides to talk about a dictionary, right? So the definitions of some of these. Very often you'll hear or you'll see people write about, this like CI, right? So you'll hear like CI/CD, right? That's what we hear a lot. And the CI, which is the first part here, is known as continuous integration, right? And there's two different ways to think about this. There's a nice definition here. It says team members integrate their work frequently, usually daily. Integrations verified by automated build and tests, right? And so what's nice about tools that we have now, it's very easy to integrate our code together. And we check things in on a very regular basis, like with pull requests and that sort of thing, right? And the tools will actually find places where there's conflicts for us. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this. GitHub has made this very popular all over the world, and now Microsoft owns that. But of course, the underlying, Git and things like that make it possible. Then there's another term here, which is the continuous testing, which isn't known as well. It's not part of this here, but the testers love this, and especially having the automated tests that are done like via the build or even done during an integration, right? So when we check things in, automated tests or a build can be automatically happening for us and give us feedback as we are checking in our code, part of our daily sort of workflow. Now, the next part of this is really confusing, and that's because if you remember a minute ago, we were talking about what was known as CI, right? CD. So the CD, what's really strange is there's two. There's continuous delivery, which is full software delivery automated up until the last environment before production, right? And then there's continuous deployment, which means this goes one step further, okay? And it goes to prod, right? So oftentimes, if a customer says they're doing CI/CD, your first question would be, are you going to prod, right? Because if they're going to prod, then they're doing this. If they're not going to prod, then they're doing this. Oftentimes what you'll see is like dev, right? And write this, test, stage, prod, right? A lot of times when teams do something like this, it means they're going like to here or to here or to here, because it could be any of those three. If they are going all the way out to prod, then that's the continuous deployment. All right. So that's the way to think about it. It doesn't mean you are doing DevOps better or you're doing it, whatever. It just means that there are some different terms that are used by different people. Okay. So let's continue on. And the next thing I want to just mention is the fantastic tooling that's come about known as Azure DevOps now, right? We used to know it as Visual Studio Online, right? And Azure DevOps has been around for, I guess almost 2 years now, I think. It's been around for a while. And there are different key pieces to Azure DevOps that make it really interesting, right? And so to kind of check off our list here, we have the different types of tools that can be used. The first is the Azure boards. And this is used for planning, tracking, our agile processes, Scrum processes to build software, right? And it's a fantastic tool. It is so configurable that it's almost confusing. But Azure boards can be as light or heavy as you want it to be to plan, track, and work on your software or your team's projects, right? Next up, I would talk about is repos, right? And so this is where we keep our code, right? You can also have things like wikis, and this is where we do kind of our advanced management around things like, pull requests to get files in when someone's writing code, that sort of thing. The Azure repos, work with the familiar tools, so they work like with Git. You can use them and connect them to almost any type of tooling as long as you have the credentials, right? Next up is probably, let's go down here and let's talk about artifacts, because artifacts sort of wrap around with the repos a bit in the sense of, we can host and share our packages here. You're really going to leverage them with pipelines, right? But depending on like what NuGet packages maybe, or other kind of npm packages, they can live in these Azure artifacts, right? So you can create your own packages, you could import packages, that sort of thing. That's what the artifacts are for. And our pipelines up here will allow us to do builds, we can do tests, we can do deployments. It's what makes the CI/CD part happen, right? And you can connect them like to GitHub, other types of providers to run our builds and our releases, which is what we're going to take a sneak peek at with some of the things today. And then last but not least is certainly the test plans, right? Where you can build tests that work with all of these tools to help you to ship a good, hopefully as bug free as possible software. Now, there are some great extensions these days that work directly with DevOps. Azure Repos extension is available for Visual Studio Code, and what's really nice is you get this kind of information down here, as you can see in Visual Studio Code, with respect to like pull requests that are out there, bugs that are happening, things like that. You can also sync your do a push from here really easily. So it's a nice, light, easy way to work with your repos. And then there's also, you can choose a different branch, things like that, right? And you can see all the different possible items that allow you to integrate Visual Studio Code out with this. So pretty nice tooling. Now, if we think about and walk past over to Azure, I mentioned earlier the starting to learn more about and being capable around the different types of integrations with Azure, right? And so, of course, working with the Azure portal, working within Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, using the PowerShell and Azure CLI, or maybe even writing custom code to talk to the REST APIs of Azure, are all different ways that you can learn to manage and write code and that sort of thing with Azure DevOps or with other tools to work with Azure, right? And so if we talk about some of the built-in kind of DevOps tooling that comes with Azure, one of the first things I wanted to highlight is the ability to work with and integrate DevOps with Azure Web Apps, or at the application service from Microsoft, right? So this is going to be something that's built into Azure, right? When you create a web application, if you've seen this before, with just a few clicks, you're able to set up a web application that's running out in the cloud. And then there's a lot of different options in terms of how to get your code on there, right? So we see like Azure DevOps, we just mentioned. You can pull it directly like from OneDrive, or if you have a local Git repository. GitHub, Bitbucket, Dropbox, more cloud types of systems. So what's great about this is that the act of creating the web app is really simple, but actually getting your code out there can be very hard. And so what Microsoft's trying to do here is make it really easy to set up your source control, as they're talking about here, figure out who's going to do your builds if your app requires a build, and then configure that and deploy it to the actual app. This is probably the most frustrating thing for the majority of application developers, right? And people that are just getting started with DevOps, because you have the web app there, but you don't have the capability, or you don't know how to get your files. Very often we still see, and I see this way too much, people FTPing their files, right? And yes, you can FTP files to a web app, but it's not very, it's not modern, I guess is the thing to say. It's a very old way to do things, right? So, and it doesn't integrate with like CI/CD, right? You know, just FTPing files, things like that. So we want to have that continuous integration, and we want to find a way to do the deployments. And what Azure is providing you is a way to build in using many different options, so whichever one you want to use. Now, another really interesting capability with Azure Web Apps is this idea of something known as deployment slots. Okay, so when we create our web application out in Azure, we are given a production slot, right? So the first website that comes up is just, it's known as production because it's the one that's deployed, okay? And then you can go and create more of these slots, right, that are a separate web application that is linked to this primary web application. And the idea is that we have separate runtimes, separate URLs. We can split the traffic between those sites, okay? And all of that is very useful. You can see one here where it says like dev, okay? In this case, and this allows us to have, without a lot of work, a second or third or fourth, up to I think 20 of these, depending on which ones you say. You have the ability to move these around and have data on two, or have two different versions of your, or more of your web apps. Now, here's kind of an example of updating this kind of web app with minimal downtime, right? So we've got a developer who checks in their code. In this case, it looks like to GitHub. The code is built and deployed to a development slot. Okay, so someone set up a pipeline to do that. Because it's in the dev test slot, then the testers can go and validate that that looks correct. Okay, and then using those slots, we can swap that into production, or I'm sorry, into staging. And so it's it's moved to staging. And you can see here where we see, Contoso-dev and Contoso-staging, right? Okay. And then after that, as long as it comes up and it looks nice and everyone signs off, like the product owner says, yes, we can go to production. Then we go to production, and all of a sudden, with DNS using our C names and that sort of thing, we end up with our production web app running at, of course, we have contoso.com, right? So that app is up and running, and all of that works. And we had that workflow where, we had a CI/CD here, right? Okay, but it didn't go to production, right? So if we think back to a minute ago, we were talking about here, okay, since we did not go to production, that means we did what? If you all have the chat window, did we go to this delivery or did we go to deployment? Which one of these CDs are we using? Because in the example, we went to dev tests, right? Here, we went to dev test. That's where the pipeline is built, right? So because of that, we are doing the delivery, right? Because we didn't go to production. We went to an environment before production, right?
Yeah, we just got an answer. Rafael Silva was the one that,
oh, there you go.
Yeah,
good.
delivery.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Exactly. So now we've got our application, and we've gone through this pipeline, and we've used these slots to manually move it over into production, right? But what happens if we start to get reports of an issue? Like we see here, we've got users, they're connecting to our production web app, and they're getting 500s or some other sorts of errors, right? The DevOps or the site reliability engineers can then swap it back. Okay, so we could move back the production code from the step before with just one click of a button, and that formerly working site would now be in production, and so our users would no longer have those issues. And as a result of that, we have rolled back the change that we put in place that got an error, right? So with that, I wanted to pop out here, and let's take a quick look at an example, right? Virgilio, can you see the screen still? I want to make sure that you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect.
And I think the
great.
Zoom is good enough.
Okay, good. So I've got a web app here that I created, right? So we've got, Azure user group here out for you all, and we've got a web app that's up and running. And if I look at the deployment slots, I have two. So I have the primary one, which was the first one, and then I also have another one here called -www. I'm going to turn on Zoom it. I think I have Zoom it on this computer. Maybe not. No, I don't. Sorry. But you can see how 100% of the traffic is going to this primary site. Okay. And if I were to click on that particular site, we should get the page to load. This is just a simple web app here that is, let me get rid of these other ones. There we go. So this is just a simple web app. It's from one of the Getting Started repositories, right? And if I go and look at the other one here, this one's called -www. If I open this one up, I don't, whoops, sorry, clicked the wrong thing. Here. Should take me to just the starter page, which it did. Okay, so what we have is this first web application, which is the initial one, and I did a deployment there, and that's where we saw the production, right? And then this other one called www. This is what I might actually point my websites to. it opened up, and then we just see the blank page, right? So if I wanted to swap between those two, I simply click the swap button, and we can say that the source, I want that. Well, I guess that's fine. We're going to swap the two, right? And we'll say swap. And what this is going to do is actually change where that app is deployed. And so this is kind of like the website that, or the slide we saw a moment ago. So this will just take a minute. Hopefully it actually works. No, I'm kidding. It will work. And this will just change the two slots, right? So what should happen is when this is done, when we refresh the pages, we'll see that the pages have switched, right? Which is just like the what we saw on the slide deck a moment ago, okay? And the number of these slots that you have is dependent on the SKU for the app service plan, okay? So it looks like that's done. So if we go here to the initial site that was had an actual deployment, so now we see that, right? So we see what was here is now on there, and if we refresh this, we see that the pages have moved, right? So really easy to move back and forth. And this is great, you know, from a DevOps perspective. If you think about the slide that we had a moment ago, where we saw this, right, where an error comes up, and then you know we get help desk calls, and we just want to make a change to go to revert to the known good state. In just a few moments, we were able to do that. Where that worked, right? So pretty neat. So that's the Azure App Services with the deployment slots, and this is something that is built into our into the Azure portal, right? So it's very easy. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out with this Azure web app is how we can connect using this deployment center, right? You saw on this slide here, right, where I had talked about these different kind of setups, right? Well, this one has been configured with a web app, right? That's deployed out into Azure. I'm going to put this link in the window for you. And so you can see that. And what I've done is I've connected this site to that external Git point. So if you connect here, what you'll see is this. This is just this simple web application that is running out there that had that carousel. It's this application, right? And one of the things that I've done is I've cloned that, okay, and I've got it here in my Visual Studio Code. So this is that web app, right? See how it says App Service Web HTML, okay? And I've cloned that. To clone that, I just opened up in the GitHub window, clicked on, where's my edge? There's edge somewhere. Lost it. Here we go. I click on clone here. Getting a bunch of static from somewhere. I don't know who that is, but if you could go on mute, that'd be great. Thank you. So
Tiago, can you mute Isaac, please?
There we go.
Thank you.
Perfect.
There you go.
So
Sorry.
here I've got this, and I've cloned this, right, like I was mentioning. And so if I open it up in Visual Studio, we can actually just go to the HTML page, and I can find one of these, like, let's find one of those tumblers. Let's see, 3 columns, so tumble. So right, so we'll put this in here, and we'll say save. So I made a quick change to the code. I'm going to go ahead and update the source control on this. So and we'll do a commit on that. And then when I I can do this here from that tool. Remember, I was talking about the Azure DevOps tool. This will also allow you to push this commit out to GitHub. So I'm going to push that. So it's going to push that. You can see the little tumbler going around there. So when that code is pushed, when I go back to the repo here, when we look at the commit, you can see now that that commit has been added for the index, right? So I made that change. If I look at the code out here and find that code, where's that at? There it is, right? So you see how that commit showed up out on GitHub, right? Well, I've got this connected to that web app, okay? So if I do a sync on that, it's going to go and start a sync to that page. You see it? So what will happen is Azure's going out and grabbing the code. It's going to look for what's changed, and it will do a deployment for me, right? So it says that yes, in fact, that it made that change. If we went and looked at our web app that was up here, we did a refresh on it. Maybe not. Should change at some point. I might be looking at the wrong one. It's going to be bot. There it is. So now we've rolled this out into that other slot, right? So now we see how that integration works. So all I had to do was go into the code here, make a change, commit it, pushed it to GitHub, and then Azure was able to deploy that code back for me, okay? So that's how a really good workflow, I mean, this is a really simple application, but at the end of the day, I can make changes really simply and have that an integrated experience across the board, right? And then if I wanted to swap those different slots, like we've got, this was the main slot. Let's do this again. We've got the main slot there, okay? And then if we looked at the other slot, let's say I wanted to, use this as like my production, right? This www, see how they're different, right? Okay, I would just go and I would do a swap again. So now I would swap the two, and then by swapping, then that update will end up in our production slot. So great integration with the portal. Very simply, you can make that change and make all of that work, right? So pretty easy, and we can take a look at that here in a second. Yeah, go ahead.
So then we have a question. So Rodrigo is asking if the way, I was just asking, so I will just reread the question so for everyone to be clear. So the very first deployment will always be the one labeled production even after we swap, or do we define in some way which one is the production one? So that's exactly what Dan just talked about, and Rodrigo just confirmed that yes, that the thing that he just covered actually replies to his question fully.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, you can actually look here now. So we just did a swap, right? So now we can look here and you'll see what's production, right? So, the main slot is always production. That's the way it's going to look. That's the where you want that to end up. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our slide deck now, and let's look next at something that's near and dear to my heart, which is production or Infrastructure as code. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second because there's something wrong with my screen. Let me do this. Let me set this back up. Give me 1 second here because for some reason it was doing something wrong. There you go. Should be able to see that now when it comes back up. So let's talk about infrastructure as code, and we're going to move over to DevOps, like Azure DevOps pipelines here. Now, many developers are very familiar with build and release pipelines for their code, and you know, that's been around for a long time. They're very easy just in terms of their general understanding because people have used them for a while. Now, with the introduction of the cloud, more developers are responsible for building the infrastructure where their web application actually runs, okay? This is very different. Traditionally, developers would only worried about writing their code. The infrastructure team would give them like a server or databases, things like that. They would just get a login, put their files, and then things would start working. Today, it's very different. With the cloud, now teams are much closer, development teams are much closer to the operational systems that actually build things. Even though they're in the cloud, you're going to be more responsible for deploying those. And the operations team, like the IT team that used to build systems maybe by hand even, right? Like they would, you know, plug in the servers and turn them on and then, you know, maybe run through different types of software installs like the installation ISOs for SQL Server or things like that, adding maybe IIS to web servers, this sort of thing. All of that's done just by code and by scripts now, right? And so in Azure, we have something known as ARM templates. There are many other ways to do infrastructure as code, but here we're talking about ARM templates, right? And ARM templates are provided by Azure to us, and it's a way for us to write and declare exactly what we want Azure to deploy for us, right? So, you know, our admins are going to provision an Azure infrastructure using a programming language, right? That's what we're doing, and that's how it's so different. And that code that you write tells Azure what to build, okay? And so in the case of ARM templates, these are JavaScript object notation, okay? And then they will tell Azure exactly what to build. So we write that code, we submit that deployment to Azure, and then Azure will go and build whatever we tell it to, right? Now, in Visual Studio Code, again, there is a fantastic set of tools built around Azure. And one of those tools is this extension, the ARM Resource Tools extension, which is really nice because it gives us IntelliSense. You see how we have the different colors, right? And gives us kind of a way to manage the template in the language. It also has, there's an integrated terminal for PowerShell or Azure CLI deployments. You can see someone here that someone's doing an AZ group deployment. So they're actually writing giving an Azure CLI command at the command prompt of a Windows box to call the Azure deployment, right? Now, when we write that template, there's lots of different configurations in there, okay? And you can have everything from the actual resources that Azure is going to deploy. That might be like a SQL server, a virtual machine, a storage account, all of the different things you need for your deployment. But there's also other things in the language that you can use, such as variables, where we're just calling a particular name of something, and we could just reference that variable, meaning we could change, like here, this I don't know, maybe this address or subnet name, we could call that for many different virtual machines, something like that, only having to call it by the variable name rather than having to hard code the name all over the portal or all over the template in many lines, okay? And then we also have something up here called parameters. Parameters are supplied by the user at runtime. So when you go to submit a deployment, you might have different types of parameters that you want to complete based on the environment type that you are going to put it in. So And here, what we're talking about is, first of all, we've got our ARM template here that we've written, okay? And we have the ability to have this work with many different types of environments. So we have our Azure-deploy JSON template, okay? And we could use that same template with different types of environments based on those parameters, okay? So here we might see parameters that we would put in for developers, for testing, for production. You could imagine a situation where your production environment might not be like these virtual machines in production. They might be much bigger, right? Like they might cost more money than these, right? In development, we might only need a few cores and a few gigabytes of RAM. Maybe we have servers that are like 2 vCPUs, 2 vCPUs and like 4 gigs of RAM. Over here, we might have like 16 CPUs and 64 gigs of RAM or something like that, right? And so we can create these parameters in the template, right, where we supply different values based on which environment it's going to be, okay? And the way that we do this with Azure DevOps with our release pipelines is through something called variable groups, okay? And the variable groups is a place for us to document these parameters, right, to build the different environments. Now, the way that this works, and here's an example here, a couple example slides for you. We have our parameters that are going to be listed. Let me change the color here for you, right? So we've got like here we've got like pricing tier, right? That is one of the pieces, and then we also have our workspace name, right? So you see those two. And so those are parameters, meaning as the user in runtime, we need to provide the data. There are some defaults, like here it says the default is premium, right? There's no default up here with the workspace name though. If we look over in this variable group, which is going to be configured on our pipeline in Azure DevOps, we have the pricing tier and the workspace name. Those match up with here, right? So they match up with the two on the template, right? But then we can provide those values, and as we do the deployment, we can create, or we'll use these. So if you think about having multiple environments like we see here, like here we have multiple environments, okay? We have the ability to then create one version for dev, one version for test, and one version for prod, okay? So we can create the variable groups to match the releases, and then we can change the values in those. We use the word tweak, meaning change the values in each one of those. So this is going to be, remember how we said we would have a sort of the small version, right, down here, and then this is like for prod, maybe that's the large version of those virtual machines, right? We're able to change the values. So here we see different values, right? Different names and different values. Here we see dev in the name. Here we see prod in the name. It's the same template with the same parameters. This is supplied by us as the DevOps administrator, okay? Now, when we create releases for these ARM templates, we will create a release for each one of our environments, okay? And then we'll attach the repo as an artifact. So here's the repo, and here is a pipeline that has one of those tasks. We will link the variable group to the release. So in this case, this is going to be a dev release, right? Release pipeline. And we know that because we've made a variable group named dev. And if you remember back here a second ago, this was dev. So when we run this one, we would see dev in the name. So when we release this was like a Databricks pipeline, I think. We release this, we have a workspace name. It's going to be Azure AI Dev Workspace. I wrote this presentation for the Azure AI conference, but it was canceled because of the COVID situation that's been going all over the world. So here you see that release pipelines for each one of those, right? And then we link those together. Now, when we go into our release tasks on the pipelines, there is, we will add this release task, and what's going to happen is we will then be presented with this window where we can put in different values. Like here, this is for dev, so we see the dev resource group. Of course, we're using the same JSON template for all of these. And then I will go in and change the parameters. So I'm going to override the template parameters to match up with the names, right? And provide the values there, okay? Now, these values will be the same in each one of the pipelines, but the fact that it's linked to a different variable group is what will pick up the different values, okay? Once we've set that up, when we do our deployment, when we trigger that deployment, then whichever pipeline we're using that's connected to the appropriate library will then be used for that deployment, all right? So let's take a look in Azure DevOps to give you a better idea and get out of the slides. And we can give you some examples. Now, let me log into Azure DevOps here, and I'm going to choose my, I've got a project here called Contoso Insurance. So this is a DevOps repo. And in here, I've got a couple of different repos. I've got a repo for something known as infrastructure. This has our deployment. That's our deployment JSON template file. What's nice is it looks, looks like the code like you've been seeing in Visual Studio Code, right? Okay. And then I also have the actual application. So this is like an MVC5 application that's running in that we will use with our deployment. So this is actually an ASP.NET app, right? So if we look at this, there's a couple things we could do. We could clone it, right? If I wanted to clone it, I could open it in Visual Studio Code, right? And by doing that, that will take me and allow me to open up. I have to actually clone it here. So let's clone it to do it here. Just do it like that. So this is going to clone that code. I'm able to open that, and we'll actually see the deployment file, right? So this is the deployment file. If we look at some of the parameters values we have here, we have like a tag value. We've got a SQL Server name. We've got a secure, a login name, a secure string for the password. Got a database name, app service plan, so a bunch of different things. All of these that are a part of this parameters area, right? All of these that are a part of the parameters area will allow us to use the variable groups that we were talking about with the override. So if you remember back here a minute ago when we were talking about these values here, see these values down at the bottom? We're talking about these parameter override values. In this case, there was only a couple. In our template, there's many more, right? Like I said, we've got the server names, we've got the app plan name, we've got a web app name. can see like it says Contoso Insurance Web App. These are the ones that I want to be able to override. If I wanted to have dev, test, prod, you know, that sort of thing. Okay. Now, let's take a look at how the pipelines are set up here. So with these resource group deployments, if I go into, I want to look at release pipelines because that's what we're talking about here. We've got our infra dev pipeline here. If I edit this, okay, I've got a couple of different things going on. The first thing is you see the repo that it's connected to? It's connected to infrastructure because that's where my deployment file was from. That's what you saw me clone down locally, right? And then in the stages, what I have is I've got an individual job with the task, and that task is that deployment create, you know, this resource group deployment, right? So I've got a deployment name that I've set up. I have a subscription that I'm using. I'm going to create or update the resource group. I've got a resource group name. That's location. We're going to use this Azure deploy. That was the file. See how it says infrastructure because that's the repo it's a part of. And then I've got these parameters that I can override. So there's some information that this provides to you here. I'll pull this out and put it in the text window so that you can see what's in that little help tip there. But basically what it's telling me is it's telling me I can click here, and then I have the ability to override these values. Okay. Now, you could actually type values in here. So, I mean, I could type like here, I could type like or something, right? I could type some value in there. But what I've done is I've referenced the variables that are made available here, and they're made available by this variable group, okay? I'm going to show you that in a second. But I'm calling out the variables that are listed here. And what's going to happen is this, what you see right here, okay? What we see right here, all of that is going to stay the same in every one of my pipelines that I'm using. I'm going to have a dev pipeline, I have a prod type pipeline, for example. All of that's exactly the same. What's different is what's linked here. And what's linked is that variable group. You see this variable group here? Policy, connect, infra dev. And now you see the real values, okay? And so this was the dev one. So we got the dev tag. And we might, you know, have a dev name. Like here, this has a dev plan name, that sort of thing, right? Okay. And if I wanted to, what I could do is I could actually clone this pipeline that I built, right? Like I could take this and I could go to the release. I could actually clone this to create another one. So I could say like clone, I'm going to clone that pipeline, and we could name it something different. Like we could name it like prod, right? And I could start to make changes. So I'm starting from the baseline of what I had over in dev, right? So anyway, so let's go back and let's look at the library, and let's look at that dev variable group. So inside of that variable group, you saw how they popped in. Here's those variables that I'm referencing, right? So database name, I'm giving that a name. You know, I could add another one, right? Best Azure user group, right? And then I could add a value, Lisbon, right? And I could save that. And then I would be able to call that variable group, or that variable that's a part of this group. And the reason why these are made available to me is, like we said, I have attached that to this pipeline, right? So I've linked that variable group. So I can say like, you know, link, and I can go in and link that there. So because that's there, then those are available, right? Now, I already ran this pipeline, so we don't need to see it. I actually had to run it a couple times to get it to work. The way that this looks is I've got this set up. When we actually run one of these deployments, it will initialize, so it grabs all the different data, finds a build machine. It's gonna see who it's requested for. It's requested from me, that sort of thing. It will move on and download the deployment, and then that sort of thing, right? Actually, that might be the wrong one. That's the host one. Sorry, I'm gonna say that doesn't look right. Here, this one. Here you go. Infrastructure. Look at the logs. It's going to download the artifacts. In this case, the artifact is going to be that JSON file, right? And then it will actually do a deployment, right? So you can see there where the deployment's being put out, right?
So then, question from Raphael. Can you reference a reference book to DevOps for infra as a code? Or some reference links that you think are extra valuable for the audience to give out a read on, apart from the ones that I think you already have on the blog that you usually contribute to, right?
Yeah, I can find some. I don't know them right offhand, so I can find a couple and put them on here. But there's definitely some things around. If you bing Azure resource group deployment, you'll probably be able to find with variable groups, something like that will probably be able to help you here. Like here's a good one right here. I would start with something like this because it will help you to get going with this, right? Now, the deployment that you saw ended up like this, right? So I have a web app, I've got an app plan, I've got SQL Server and a database, right? And so that's how all of those different pieces kind of come together, okay? So let's go back and let's look at now, how do we get an application there, right? So the next thing we want to do is talk about build and release pipelines. And this is, again, a simple, it's an ASP.NET application that's going to run in a web app, right? And the first thing we're going to do is want to build the application, right? So the build pipelines, again, are going to be used for this. They're going to package our software up for deployment, get it ready. Again, we can use the variable groups if there are specific values that we want to call, depending on if it's a development or test or prod, so you can use those. We can trigger a build automatically by setting up that continuous integration like we talked about earlier today. On the build pipeline, we can say when the code changes, I want Azure DevOps to build it for me automatically. So instead of me having to go run the build when I do a check-in, it will do a build automatically. And there are other things called gates that allow you to maybe seek approvals from development managers or, depending on criteria that you could integrate with your builds, that sort of thing. Now, there are pretty easy build task templates that you can use. You can also write your build pipelines in YAML if you're more experienced, so you can do both. But there are very nice, commonly available ones like a Docker, a Docker Compose, that sort of thing, or depending on what type of technology you're using, Microsoft has many different versions of these build pipelines for you. And then to release the pipeline, we will go and create a release, and this will actually deploy the code out onto our app, right? So it's more of a two-step process where we're building it, so we actually have the source code turned into a package of our application, and then the release will actually push it to the location we want it to run. Again, variable groups can be used for different inputs that you might have. So if you have specific types of information, like maybe you have a different production configuration than for test, that sort of thing, right? Now the releases.
Then
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're gonna touch into that, but now that you're talking about variable groups, maybe you can point out where we can get those groups and if they can map to key vault defined variables also, and how can you use them to apply different resource groups in different types of stages on the different pipelines.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I can pop over to that now because that's kind of where I was heading. So that's great. In the library of pipelines, that's where our variable groups are held. And you might have noticed how we had like a password here, right? And you can put in a password here and lock it, right? So like I could change this to my, a different password and lock that, and it will be permanently locked there. You can't get it. There's also the ability here to leak secrets from a key vault. You see this? Leak secrets from a key vault as variables. So if I have that turned on, which I don't want to do that because it'll mess with all of
yes,
mine.
it will mess with ourselves. With yourself.
It'll mess those up. Yeah. If you connect it to the key vault, then yes, you could, build a key vault out in Azure and connect those secrets to there, right? I'm not sure I have a key vault out here, but we could probably do one really quick. And what's great about this is the secrets then can be connected from there, right? So I'll do Azure key vault. They'll let me do that. East US 2, right? I can create this really fast. And then we can create a new variable group and connect to it. There's a couple of important things to know about the key vault connections to variable groups, and that is that if you connect one of your libraries to, or one of your variable groups to one of these, you can only have the values there, right? So here we can say key vault demo variable group. And when this completes, okay, it's good, right? We can link it to there. Hopefully I put that in the right description. See if it'll find it. There it is. So now I can authorize its use. Oh, didn't like that. That's what I get for trying to do a demo on the fly for Julio. But you see how you do this. No, that's okay. I mean, it's a great point though, because you can definitely link the secrets to there, right? And when you've done that, all of your secrets would be in the key vault, right? And what's really nice about this is with the key vault, we can have other items in Azure access that key vault as well as the pipeline. So imagine like we wanted to keep a password for the pipeline in the key vault, but also like maybe certificates or other things, either the pipeline or other services in Azure can access the key vault. The way that I had my password, which is a secret, right? I'll leave this alone. Over here, like here, the only thing that can access that is the pipeline, right? So it is nice. You can use the key vault to store things like certificates and secrets and that sort of thing. So let's take a really fast look at our different pipelines that we had. If we look at, I've got my host pipeline.
We are roughly 10 minutes away.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to show you really fast the pipelines. Yep. You've got the pipeline for the build. So here, this is going to be like a build pipeline. If we edit that and just look at it, this one is just set up as a real simple build, right? That's going to build our solution. we could kick that off, and then the release pipeline on the other side, this one is going to be set up to do a deployment. So this is going to actually deploy the application over to the web app. You can see our web app here, and we can actually do a deployment to it, right? So, Virgilia, I don't know if you wanted to open up for questions, maybe, or if you wanted to, I could kick one of these off. Whatever you wanted to do is
yeah. So I'll be always popping up questions if they show up on the chat.
Yep.
So Mohammed's asking, hi Dan, what do you think of Azure VMware solution? Any information will be helpful.
Azure VMware solution. Well, different topic than what we're talking about here, but I can tell you that I actually have an article that I'm writing right now about this. Believe it or not, it'll be out in a couple of weeks. So Azure had a solution with a company called Cloud Simple that was available for a while, and Cloud Simple was actually purchased by Google. Yeah, and so when that happened, Microsoft sort of went a different direction, right? And there are some new capabilities that are in preview that are coming out where Microsoft is going to have a full VMware solution that works in their data centers. And what they give you is a basically dedicated hardware to run, and they'll install like vCenter and that sort of thing on it. And you can put your VMware VMs out in Azure. What's really interesting about it is you end up with a private ExpressRoute connection in your subscription that's only for this. It's very strange. It looks like this. Let me grab a pen really quick. So imagine you have here, you have a virtual network. So this is like a VNet in a region. And you have like a site-to-site or an ExpressRoute to your location here. Okay, so this is like your on-prem. And so you've got a firewall here. Of course, you've got the virtual network gateway here. And then you've got different VMs that are running in your virtual network, right? Then they give you another ExpressRoute connection to an actual server rack in the Azure data center. And it's connected then to dedicated storage. So this is ESX, right? And it also uses NSX for microsegmentation. What's really interesting is this. So it's an ExpressRoute connection from a dedicated piece of hardware to your VNet. And then you have another ExpressRoute connection here, right? And then there's something called Global Reach. If you've ever heard of ExpressRoute Global Reach, that allows you to talk from here directly to here. This is really fascinating. But there's more coming about this. Azure VMware Services is definitely an up and coming thing. So look for more info on that. I'll have an article about it out in a couple of weeks. And there's, you can actually search, and they've got some new articles out there now. It looks like there was another question.
Yeah, so we are getting another question. If you're a sysadmin recently, so Visa mentioned that he's a sysadmin recently started infrastructure as code on Azure DevOps. So he wants to know what role can a ops guy have inside Azure DevOps, and if there are any particular skill sets or a roadmap to kickstart and become an expert.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, right? About how to become, really valuable to an organization. And I would say the first thing is going to be ARM templates, right? That's one box that you want to check off. You need to learn how to do ARM. PowerShell or CLI. One or the other, okay? If you can do both, great, right? But knowing how to do this, and what I mean by this is I mean Azure, right? So the Azure commandlets, that sort of thing. These are going to be really important. Those are the two basic areas that you want to start with, okay? Really useful tools to get started with this stuff. If you look for the Azure Quick Start templates on this repo, right? This repo here, this is a great place to start, okay? There's no doubt about it. And then I have some things also on build 5.9s. We have something that we call Azure Kung Fu. If you go to Azure Kung, oh, it didn't do it. It didn't do it. Did you see that, Virgilio? I don't know why.
Yeah. It was weird.
Yeah, I don't know what it's doing.
There.
I don't know why that's working. That's not it. Okay, well, let me just get you a direct link. If you go to the Build 5.9s page, this is our blog. We get about 1 million hits a year. If you go to the Azure Kung Fu section, we have this whole thing to help you get started with the Azure CLI. Okay, and there's a couple of great things in here for a starting DevOps person. So the first one, and you can scroll down to here and learn all about what we're talking about, because this is just exactly for you, right? There is something called the Azure Kung Fu VM, and this is a great way to get like an admin workstation to start working with Azure, right? So this will give you basically an Office 365 machine. It's got Azure Storage Explorer, Git, PuTTY, sysinternals. It even has Windows subsystem for Linux. You see that? So we get you started with that. This is all running in a VM in Azure, right? So you just click this button to do a deployment, fill out a couple of pieces of information, and this will start you with a virtual machine that you can learn to code with, right? So you only have to put in a couple pieces of information, including like your IP address, so that it's locked down. And then you'll end up with this great virtual machine that will have Windows subservice for Linux on it, and that will have you started. And then there's another repo called the Toolkit, and this Azure Toolkit that we wrote has many example scripts in it, okay? So all about how to use the Azure CLI. We show you how to get started with it, how to use Visual Studio Code. We give you tons of feedback on how to clone it, how to learn how to use the Azure CLI. So it's really great. And there's tons of great examples in here, and I'll show you a couple. If you go to the toolkit, all of these are designed based around the different types of deployments that you might do. And this is open source, by the way, Virgilio, so get your code on, okay? I want to see you out here.
Yeah, I know that he wants some of it, actually.
Yeah, well, what's fantastic is, what's fantastic here is that you, it's very hard to read the docs and like have a sample. Like even the samples are hard to read. They're kind of like the SDKs, like the software development kits. It's not a concrete example. Whereas here, if you want to do something like, I don't know, maybe what do we have on here? Like change a disk type. Here is an example that we have for you that actually shows you how do I set my account, how do I, assign some variables. How do I find a bunch of machines and then like even write an array to change a bunch of machines, right? So there's some great simple examples and also some more advanced ones to get you going using the CLI. So things like this will help you, right? Here we teach you how to find an image name, teach you the command. So, this is just open source stuff that Chris and I have done to try to keep our MVP, hopefully, right? And so I think that, go check out this Azure Kung Fu stuff, because it will really help you to get started with this. I'll put this link in here as well.
So we still have another question it's from Saeed. Do you think that Microsoft will continue to support Terraform as an infrastructure as code automation language? And I heard that Microsoft is getting away from ARM templates.
So ARM templates are definitely not going away. I can tell you that for sure, because everything under the covers in Azure is JSON is ARM. Okay, so now the big thing that has been out there forever with Terraform is Terraform gives you a great benefit, and I've done a lot of Terraform. And that benefit is what we call state. And state simply means what is currently implemented in Azure, right? So what are the state of things, okay? And when you write your Terraform code, you do essentially a build by running a Terraform plan. That plan will look at your current state and determine what's going to change if you implement or if you apply that code, okay? Now, traditionally, ARM does not do that. ARM comes up with what is a state based on what's deployed in Azure. So the Azure API in the background does effectively the same thing. It does its own plan, okay? Does not give you a plan, right? I think that Terraform is a fantastic tool. Like all tools, it has its ups and downs, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I think that probably the biggest problem that I have with Terraform is that it always is slower than Microsoft because it's not a Microsoft tool and it's an open source tool. So the community has to catch up on things. If you have like a new switch, a new parameter, a new, something that's part of Azure, it's not going to be, automatically available to you in the Terraform provider. And sometimes it can be months and months and months.
Yeah.
We've had people at Alliance that go and we actually write code and do pull requests to the Terraform provider so that we can write code for a customer. That can be a little scary, right? So that's probably the biggest drawback. But you could debate that well, you get to write the code, so maybe it isn't a drawback. I don't know. But I think that Terraform will last for a long time. I don't think Terraform is going to go away. There are other newer types of tools such as Pulumi that are coming out that are pretty interesting, where you can, Terraform has its own language, right? Pulumi you can write in C#. So it's an interesting up and comer.
Yeah.
But no matter what, I think the templates will be around until we get the next version of how we manage ARM, whenever that is.